Section 36 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6. Edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Sicilian Vespers, A.D. 1282, by Michele Amari. Under Frederick II, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Sicily had been governed wisely. His son Conrad succeeded him as King of Sicily in 1250, but went to Germany, where his crown was being contested by William of Holland, leaving his illegitimate brother Manfred to administer Sicily. Conrad and his brother Henry died in 1254. Manfred continued to rule Sicily as regent for his nephew Conradin, son of Conrad, but in 1258, upon a rumor of Conradin's death, assumed the crown. Pope Alexander IV and his successor Urban IV, a Frenchman, would not recognize Manfred as ruler. Urban offered the Sicilian crown to a brother of Louis IX of France, Charles, Count of Anjou, who promised to hold Sicily as a fief of the Holy See. Charles was compelled to conquer his new kingdom, and with a large army of Frenchmen invaded Sicily. Manfred was defeated and slain in a sanguinary battle at Grandella, near Benevento, and Charles soon made himself master of the kingdom. Young Conradin was still living, but was defeated at Tagliacozzo in 1268, and was beheaded at Naples by order of Charles. The French earned the scarcely veiled hatred of the Sicilians by their tyranny and cruelties, and a conspiracy arose to give the crown to Pedro, King of Aragon, who had married Constance, daughter of Manfred. Charles of Anjou was not ignorant of the fact that his throne was in danger, nor was he totally unprepared. The overthrow of the French power in Sicily, however, was precipitated by an incident at Palermo on Easter Monday, the 30th of March, 1282, which led to the wholesale massacre known to history as the Sicilian Vespers, because of its commencement at the hour of Vespers. The Sicilians endured the French yoke, though cursing it, until the spring of 1282. The military preparations of the King of Aragon were not yet completed, nor, even if partially known in Sicily, could they inspire any immediate hope. The people were overawed by the immense armaments of Charles destined against Constantinople, and 42 royal castles, either in principal cities or in situations of great natural strength, served to keep the island in check. A still greater number were held by French feudatories. The standing troops were collected and in arms, and the feudal militia, composed in great part of foreign subfeudatories, waited only the signal to assemble. In such a posture of affairs, which the foresight of the prudent would never have selected for an outbreak, the officers of Charles continued to grind down the Sicilian people, satisfied that their patience would endure forever. New outrages shed a gloom over the festival of Easter at Palermo, the ancient capital of the kingdom, detested by the strangers more than any other city as being the strongest and the most deeply injured. Messina was the seat of the king's viceroy in Sicily, Herbert of Orleans. Palermo was governed by the justiciary of Valdemezzara, John of St. Remigio, a minister worthy of Charles. His subalterns, worthy both of the justiciary and of the king, had recently launched out into fresh acts of rapine and violence. But the people submitted. It even went so far that the citizens of Palermo, seeking comfort from God amid their worldly tribulations, and having entered a church to pray, in that very church, on the days sacred to the memory of the Saviour's Passion, and amid the penitential rites, were exposed to the most cruel outrages. The banddogs of the exchequer searched out among them those who had failed in the payment of the taxes, dragged them forth from the sacred edifice, manacled, and bore them to prison, crying out insultingly before the multitude attracted to the spot, "Pay, Fattorini, pay!" and the people still submitted. The Monday after Easter, which fell on the 30th of March, there was a festival at the Church of Santo Spirito. On that occasion, a heinous outrage against the liberties of the Sicilians afforded the impulse, and the patience of the people gave way. Half a mile from the southern wall of the city, on the brink of the ravine of Oreto, stands a church dedicated to the Holy Ghost, concerning which the Latin fathers have not failed to record that on the day on which the first stone of it was laid, in the 12th century, the sun was darkened by an eclipse. On one side of it were the precipice and the river, on the other the plain extending to the city, which in the present day is in great part divided by walls and dotted with gardens, while a square enclosure of moderate size, shaded by dusky cypresses, honeycombed with tombs, and adorned with urns and other sepulchral monuments, surrounds the church. This is a public cemetery, laid out toward the end of the 18th century, and fearfully filled in 3 weeks by the dire pestilence which devastated Sicily in 1837. On the Tuesday following Easter, at the hour of Vespers, religion and custom drew crowds of people to this cheerful plain, then carpeted with the flowers of spring. Citizens, wending their way toward the church, divided into numerous groups. They walked, sat in clusters, spread the tables, or danced upon the grass, and, whether it were a defect or a merit of the Sicilian character, threw off for the moment the recollection of their sufferings. Suddenly the followers of the justiciary appeared among them, and every bosom thrilled with a shudder of disgust. The strangers came with their usual insolent demeanor, as they said, to maintain tranquillity, and for this purpose they mingled with the groups, joined in the dances, and familiarly accosted the women, pressing the hand of one, taking unwarranted liberties with others, addressing indecent words and gestures to those more distant, until some temperately admonished them to depart in God's name without insulting the women, and others murmured angrily. But the hot-blooded youths raised their voices so fiercely that the soldiers said to one another, "These insolent Paterini must be armed, that they dare thus to answer," and replied to them with the most offensive insults, insisting with great insolence on searching them for arms, and even here and there striking them with sticks or thongs. Every heart already throbbed fiercely on either side, when a young woman, of singular beauty and of modest and dignified deportment, appeared with her husband and relations, bending her steps toward the church. Drouet, a Frenchman, impelled either by insolence or license, approached her, as if to examine her for concealed weapons, seized her, and searched her bosom. She fell fainting into her husband's arms, who, in a voice almost choked with rage, exclaimed, "Death! Death to the French!" At the same moment a youth burst from the crowd which had gathered round them, sprang upon Drouet, disarmed and slew him, and probably at the same moment paid the penalty by the loss of his own life, leaving his name unknown and the mystery forever unsolved, whether it were love for the injured woman, the impulse of a generous heart, or the more exalted flame of patriotism that prompted him thus to give the signal of deliverance. Noble example has a power far beyond that of argument or eloquence to rouse the people, and the erstwhile abject slaves awoke at length from their long bondage. "Death, death to the French," they cried, and the cry, say the historians of the time, re-echoed like the voice of God through the whole country and found an answer in every heart. Above the corpse of Drouet were heaped those of the slain on either side. The crowd expanded itself, closed in, and swayed hither and thither in wild confusion. The Sicilians, with sticks, stones, and knives, rushed with desperate ferocity upon their fully armed opponents. They sought for them and hunted them down. Fearful tragedies were enacted amid the preparations for festivity, and the overthrown tables were drenched with blood. The people displayed their strength and conquered. The struggle was brief, and great the slaughter of the Sicilians, but of the French there were 200, and 200 fell. Breathless, covered with blood, brandishing the plundered weapons, and proclaiming the insult and its vengeance, the insurgents rushed toward the tranquil city. "Death to the French!" they shouted, and as many as they found were put to the sword. The example, the words, the contagion of passion in an instant aroused the whole people. In the heat of the tumult, Roger Mastrangelo, a nobleman, was chosen, or constituted himself, their leader. The multitude continued to increase. Dividing into troops, they scoured the streets, burst open doors, searched every nook, every hiding place, and shouting, "Death to the French," smote them and slew them, while those too distant to strike added to the tumult by their applause. On the outbreak of this sudden uproar, the justiciary had taken refuge in his strong palace. The next moment it was surrounded by an enraged multitude crying aloud for his death. They demolished the defenses and rushed furiously in, but the justiciary escaped them. Favored by the confusion and the closing darkness, he succeeded, though wounded in the face, in mounting his horse unobserved, with only 2 attendants, and fled with all speed. Meanwhile, the slaughter continued with increased ferocity. Even the darkness of night failed to arrest it, and it was resumed the next day more furiously than ever. Nor did it finally cease because the thirst for vengeance was slaked, but because victims were wanting to appease it. 2,000 French perished in this first outbreak. Even Christian burial was denied them, but pits were afterward dug to receive their despised remains, and tradition still points out a column surmounted by an iron cross, raised by compassionate piety on one of these spots, probably long after the perpetration of the deed of vengeance. Tradition, moreover, relates that the sound of a word, like the shibboleth of the Hebrews, was the cruel test by which the French were distinguished in the massacre, and that if there were found a suspicious or unknown person, he was compelled, with a sword to his throat, to pronounce the word "Chichiri," and the slightest foreign accent was the signal for his death. Forgetful of their own character, and as if stricken by fate, the gallant warriors of France neither fled nor united nor defended themselves. They unsheathed their swords and presented them to their assailants, imploring, as if in emulation of each other, to be the first to die. Of one common soldier it is recorded that, having concealed himself behind a wainscot, and being dislodged at the sword's point, he resolved not to die unavenged, and springing forth with a wild cry upon the ranks of his enemies, slew 3 of them before he himself perished. The insurgents broke into the convents of the Minorites and preaching friars, and slaughtered all the monks whom they recognized as French. Even the altars afforded no protection. Tears and prayers were alike unheeded. Neither old men, women, nor infants were spared. The ruthless avengers of the ruthless massacre of Augusta swore to root out the seed of the French oppressors throughout the whole of Sicily, and this vow they cruelly fulfilled, slaughtering infants at their mothers' breasts, and after them the mothers themselves, not sparing even pregnant women, but with a horrible refinement of cruelty, ripping up the bodies of Sicilian women who were with child by French husbands, and dashing against the stones the fruit of the mingled blood of the oppressors and the oppressed. This general massacre of all who spoke the same language, and these heinous acts of cruelty, have caused the Sicilian Vespers to be classed among the most infamous of national crimes. The very atrocity of the Vespers proved the salvation of Sicily by cutting off all possibility of compromise. On that same blood-stained night of the 31st of March, the people of Palermo assembled in Parliament, and, divided between the triumph of vengeance and terror at their own daring act, advanced still more decidedly in the path they had chosen. They abolished monarchy, and resolved to establish a commonwealth under the protection of the Church of Rome. They were moved to this determination by deadly hatred against Charles and his government, and the recollection of the stern rule of the Swabian dynasty on the one hand, and on the other by grateful remembrance of the liberty enjoyed in 1254, by the example of the Tuscan and Lombard republics, and by the natural pride of a powerful city, which, having freed itself from a detested yoke, confided in its own strength. The name of the Church was added in order to disarm the wrath of the Pope, to tempt his ambition, or to justify the rebellion under the pretext that in driving out their more immediate but criminal ruler, they contemplated no infraction of loyalty to the suzerain from whom he held his power. Roger Mastrangelo, Henry Baresi, and Nicoloso of Ordaleva, knights, and Niccolo of Ebdemonia, were proclaimed captains of the people with 5 counselors. By the glare of torchlight on the bloody ground, amid the noise and throng of the armed multitude, and with all the sublime pomp of tumult, the Republican magistrates were inaugurated. Trumpets and Moorish kettledrums sounded, and thousands upon thousands of voices uttered the joyous cry, "The Republic and Liberty!" The ancient banner of the city, a golden eagle in a red field, was unfolded to wave amid new glories, and in homage to the church the keys of St. Peter were quartered upon it. At midnight, John of St. Remigio stayed his rapid flight at Vicari, a castle 30 miles distant from the capital, where, knocking loudly and hurriedly, he was with difficulty recognized by the garrison, half drunk from the celebration of the same festival which had bred so fearful a slaughter in Palermo. Having admitted him, they were transfixed with amazement at seeing their justiciary at so unreasonable an hour, unescorted, breathless, and covered with blood. John refused all explanation at the time, but the next morning at daybreak he called to arms all the French of the neighborhood, a feudal militia well inured to warfare, and breaking silence, urged them to resist, and perhaps to avenge, the fate of their comrades. It was not long before the forces of Palermo, which had set out at dawn in pursuit of the fugitive, whose traces they had discovered, arrived at full speed beneath the walls of Vicari, and surrounded the city in disorder, impatient for the assault, but not perceiving how it was to be made. They had recourse to threats, and demanded immediate surrender, promising to the inhabitants the safety of their persons, and to John and his followers permission, on laying down their arms, to embark for Aigues-Mortes in Provence. They, however, disdaining such conditions, and regarding the mob of assailants with contempt, made a vigorous sortie. At first, military discipline obtained the advantage, and the Sicilians gave way, but the tide of battle was turned by a power beyond that of human skill, by the spirit which had given birth to the Vespers, and which suddenly blazed up again in the scattered squadrons. They paused, they looked at one another. "Death, death to the French," they cried, and rushing upon them with irresistible fury, they drove back the veteran warriors into the fortress, defeated and in confusion. After this, it was in vain that the French proposed terms of surrender. Heedless of the rules of war, the young archers of Cacamo shot the justiciary as he presented himself upon the walls, and, seeing him fall, the whole multitude rushed to the assault, occupied the fortress, put the garrison to the sword, and flung their corpses piecemeal to the dogs and to the vultures. This done, the host returned to Palermo. Meanwhile, the fame of what had occurred spread rapidly from town to town, and the first in that neighborhood to rise was Corleone, as chief in population and importance, and also because of its numerous Lombard inhabitants, who held the name of Angevins and Guelphs in abhorrence, and of the intolerable burdens imposed upon it by the near neighborhood of the royal farms. This city, afterwards surnamed the Valiant, boldly followed the example of the capital, sent William Basso, William Corto, and Giuliano de Meraldo as orators to Palermo, to propose terms of alliance and fraternity between the two cities, mutual assistance in arms, forces, and money, reciprocal privileges of citizenship, and enfranchisement from all burdens laid upon such as were not citizens. It is not known whether the idea of the League originated with the Republican rulers of Palermo or with the patriots of Corleone, But whichever may have been the case, it clearly exhibits the preponderance in those early days of the municipal tendency, and the exchange of feudal relations for the federal union of communities, the banner under which the revolution spread itself throughout the entire island. The assembled people of Palermo, with one voice, accepted the terms, and by their desire, on the 3rd of April, they were sworn to on the Gospels by the captains and councillors of the city, with the deputies of Corleone, and officially registered among the public acts. Palermo binding herself, moreover, to assist her ally in the destruction of the strong fortress of Calatamaro. Meanwhile, one Boniface, elected captain of the people of Corleone, went forth with 3,000 men to scour the surrounding country. The royal farms were plundered and devastated. The herds, which had been carefully fattened for the army of the East, were confiscated to the service of the Sicilian revolution. The castles of the French were stormed, their houses sacked, and the massacre so ruthless that, according to Saba Malaspina, it seemed as if every man either had the death of a father, son, or brother to revenge, or firmly believed that the slaughter of a Frenchman was an act well-pleasing to God. Thus, in a very few days, the movement propagated itself many miles around, owing to the similarity of sentiments, the force of example, and the energy of the insurgents. In many places, it assumed a character which must be inexplicable to those who, in spite of all that has been already stated, would persist in regarding these tumultuous outbreaks as the result of conspiracy. While the people showed the utmost readiness to put the foreigners to the sword, yet they feared to disown the name of King Charles. Their hesitation lasted but a few days, for they were carried away by the impulse of universal feeling and by the strength of the rebels, so that all, by degrees, declared themselves elected chiefs to lead their forces against the French, and captains of the people whom they sent to the capital, the fame of whose example had roused their courage, and was now the center of all their confidence, of all their hopes. This first nucleus of the representatives of the nation being thus assembled in Palermo, they became imbued with the same valor which in one short night had raised a popular tumult to the dignity of a revolution. They were further encouraged by the manly energy of the people, who, mingled with insurgents from the surrounding towns, traversed the city to and fro, eagerly relating to one another the outrages they had suffered, and crying aloud, "Death rather than the yoke of the French." So that no sooner were the syndics of the greater part of Valdamezzara assembled in Parliament, than they agreed to the establishment of the republican form of government conducted in the name of the Church. The people without responded with loud acclamations and shouts of "the Republic" and "liberty." All encouraged each other to venture everything, when Roger Mastrangelo, bent on urging them on so far that all retreat should be cut off, and that they might be able to control the course of events, rose and boldly thus addressed the assembly. "Citizens, I hear daring words and solemn oaths, but I see no symptoms of action, as if the blood that has been shed were the seal of victory, rather than the provocation of a long and deadly struggle. Do you know Charles and his thousands of executioners, and can you yet amuse yourselves with the decoration of banners? Not far distant on the mainland are armies and navies ready for the Grecian war. There are the French panting for vengeance, and in a few days they will burst upon us. If they find our ports open for their disembarkation, if our inertness or our faults favor their progress, they will soon spread throughout the whole of Sicily. They will subdue the irresolute people by force of arms, deceive them with reports of our unhappy divisions, seduce them with promises, and drag them back to the shameful yoke of bondage, or drive them to raise their parricidal weapons against ourselves. You have sworn to die or to be free, and you will become slaves and will not all die, for the butchers will at length be weary, and will reserve the herd of survivors to exercise upon them their despotic will. Sicilians, remember the days of Conradin. To halt now will be destruction. to pursue our course, glory and deliverance. Our forces are sufficient to raise the whole country as far as Messina, and Messina must not belong to the foe. We share the same origin, the same language, the same past glory and present shame, the same experience that slavery and misery are the result of division. All Sicily is stained with the blood of the strangers. She is strong in the courage of her sons, in the ruggedness of her mountains, in the protection of the seas, which are her bulwarks. Who then shall set foot upon her soil except to find in it a yawning grave? Christ, who preached liberty to mankind, who inspired you to effect this blessed deliverance, now extends to you his almighty hand, if you will but act like men in your own defense. Citizens, captains of the people, it is my counsel that messengers be sent to all the other towns, inviting them to unite with us for the maintenance of the commonwealth, that by force of arms, by daring, and by rapidity of action, we should aid the weak, determine the doubtful, and combat the froward. For this purpose, let us divide into 3 bands which may simultaneously traverse the whole island. Then let a general parliament mature our counsels, unite our views, and regulate the form of government. For I call God to witness that Palermo aspires not to dominion, but seeks only liberty for all, and for herself the glory of being foremost in peril. And the people of Corleone, replied Boniface, will follow the fortunes of this noble city, the fortress and ornament of Sicily. Corleone sends hither 3,000 of her warriors to conquer or to die with you. But if our fate be to perish, let all those perish with us who would take part with the stranger in the day of the deliverance of Sicily. Thou, Roger, valiant in fight and sage in counsel, thou hast spoken words of safety. Henceforward he who lingers is a traitor to his country. Let us arm ourselves and go forth. Forward, forward, thundered the voice of the people in answer to his words. And with marvelous celerity the messengers were dispatched. The forces assembled and sent forth in 3 divisions, one to the left toward Cefalù, one to the right upon Calatafimi, and the third toward the center of the island through Castro Giovanni. They displayed the banner of the Commonwealth with the keys of St. Peter depicted around them, and their fame went before them, awakening hope and desire in all hearts. Hence every city and town unhesitatingly renounced allegiance to Charles, with a degree of unity which was admirable, except in regard to the slaughter of the French. They were hunted down in the mountains and forests, assaulted and vanquished in the castles, and pursued with such fury that even to those who had escaped from the hands of the Sicilians life became a burden, and from the most impregnable fortresses, from the remotest hiding places, they gave themselves up into the hands of the people who summoned them to die. Some even precipitated themselves from the towers of their strongholds. A very few, aided either by fortune or by their own valor, escaped with their lives, but were despoiled of everything, and these sought refuge in Messina. But the fate of William Porcelet merits special remembrance. He was lord or governor of Calatafimi, and, amid the unbridled iniquity of his countrymen, was distinguished for justice and humanity. On the day of vengeance, in the full flush of its triumph and fury, the Palermitan host appeared at Calatafimi, and not only spared the life of William and of his family, but treated him with distinguished honor and sent him back to Provence, a fact which goes to prove that for the excesses committed by the people, ample provocation had not been wanting. Meanwhile, the great object toward which every effort was directed was to gain over Messina to the cause of the revolution, for all comprehended the importance of her situation, of her seaport, and of the powerful and wealthy city herself, obviously marked out as the keystone of the war, as well as the pressing necessity of obtaining her alliance or of making a desperate effort to subdue her by force of arms. Negotiations were therefore commenced. Of those which were private and the most efficacious, no record has been handed down to us, but of those publicly conducted a letter is still extant, dated from Palermo the 13th of April, and dispatched by messengers to Messina, which begins thus: The Palermitans to the noble citizens of the illustrious city of Messina, bondsmen under Pharaoh in dust and mire, greeting and deliverance from the servile yoke by the arm of liberty. Rise, continues the epistle, rise, O daughter of Zion, and reassert thy former strength. Cease thy lamentations, which only awaken contempt. Take thy weapons, thy quiver and thy bow, and unbind the fetters from thy neck. It proceeds to speak of Charles as a Nero, a wolf, a lion, and a ferocious dragon. Then, reverting to Messina, it exclaims, The voice of God says to thee, Take up thy bed and walk, for thou art whole. And again it exhorts her citizens to struggle with the old serpent, and being regenerate, like newborn babes, to suck the milk of liberty, to seek justice, and to fly from calamity and ignominy. While the Palermitans sought to gain over the citizens by these biblical metaphors, Herbert of Orleans strengthened himself with foreign arms, and with the support of the Messinese nobles, who by abuses and oppression had exalted themselves above their fellow citizens, and therefore now resolutely sided with the vicar. But first he sent 7 Messinese galleys to attack Palermo under the command of Richard de Riso, who in 1268 had dared with a few vessels to confront the whole Pisan fleet, and who was now to lose in civil war his honor as a citizen and his reputation as a leader. For uniting with 4 galleys from Amalfi under the command of Matthew del Guidici and Roger of Salerno, he proceeded to blockade the port of Palermo, and, as he was unable to effect anything else, approached the walls and caused the name of Charles to be shouted aloud, together with insults and menaces to the citizens. They, however, with the long suffering of conscious strength, replied that they would neither return the insults nor his blows. The Messinese and the Palermitans were brothers, the French oppressors their only enemies, and they would do better to turn their arms against the tyrants. With these words, they hoisted the standard of the Cross of Messina upon the walls beside the eagle of Palermo. The city of Messina, or rather those who wielded the municipal authority, in order to prove their loyalty, on the 15th of April, sent 500 crossbowmen, under the command of Ciriolo, a knight of Messina, to garrison Taormina and prevent its occupation by the insurgents. The people, on the other hand, felt their Sicilian blood boil as they received the news of the rising in Palermo and in the other cities, of the progress of the insurgents through the island, and of the slaughter and flight of the French, heightened by many false or exaggerated reports. And when they beheld the fugitives enter Messina destitute and terror-stricken, they began to murmur and show animosity against the soldiers of Herbert. These, feeling themselves no longer safe in the city, withdrew, some to the castle of Matagrafone, some to the royal palace where Herbert resided. The latter, in an evil hour, decided on a display of energy. He sent 90 horsemen under Micheletto Gatta to occupy the defenses of Taormina, as if unable to repose confidence in the Messinese garrison, and the latter, seeing them approach in such arrogant and almost hostile guise, and incited by a citizen named Bartholomew, received them with a cry of insulting defiance and a shower of arrows. The contest being thus engaged, 40 of the French remained on the field. The rest fled precipitately for refuge to the castle of Scaletta, and the Sicilians, tearing down the banners of Charles, marched upon Messina to compel her to join the rebellion. In the city thousands were willing, but none had courage for the work, till a man of the people, Bartholomew Maniscalco by name, conspired with several others to give the signal of action. Meanwhile, forces were preparing to repulse the insurgents from Taormina, and the more prudent of the citizens deplored the impending effusion of the blood of their brethren. The people were on the alert, nor did the conspirators hold back. Perhaps the entrance into the port of a Palermitan galley and the slaughter by her crew of a few French who had fallen into their hands hastened the event. It was the 28th of April, when from the midst of the tumultuous crowd broke forth the cries of "Death to the French! Death to those who side with them!" and the massacre commenced. The victims, however, were but few, as the previous threatening aspect of the people had cleared the city of the greater number of the French. Maniscalco, meanwhile, with his confederates, hoisted the cross of Messina in the place of the detested banner of Anjou. For a brief space he was captain of the people, but owing either to his own modesty or to the influence of the more powerful citizens, which always prevailed in the industrial city of Messina, that same night, by their advice, he resigned the government to Baldwin Musone, a noble returned but a few hours before, with Matthew and Baldwin de Riso, from the court of King Charles. On the following day, the municipal council having been assembled in form, Musone was hailed captain by the entire people, and calling on the sacred name of Christ, the republic was proclaimed under the protection of the church. The gonfalon, or great banner of the city, was displayed with the utmost pomp. The judges Reynald de Limoges and Nicoloso Saporito, the historian Bartholomew of Niacastro, and Peter Ancelone were elected as councillors of the new government, and all the public officers, even to the executioners, were likewise elected, as if to show that henceforward the sword of justice was to rule in place of disorder and violence. But it was yet too soon for so complete a revolution. On the 30th of April, the galleys were recalled from Palermo, whither messengers of friendship and alliance were dispatched in their stead. Herbert, feeling himself no longer secure in the castle, had recourse to the old maneuver of fomenting divisions, but with no better success. He dispatched Matthew, a member of the family of Riso, which from consciousness of guilt had allied itself with him, to endeavor to gain over Baldwin Musone. Matthew accordingly sought him, and in presence of all the other councillors admonished him, using the arguments of a crooked policy, to reflect on the great power of the king, and that this insane tumult would deprive Messina of the advantages that would naturally accrue to her from the rebellion of Palermo. What were the Palermitans to him, that he should share their madness? In what had Charles injured him or his city? How is it possible, continued he, that thou, who wast but yesterday loyal to the king, a friend to us, and the companion of our journey, shouldst have secretly nourished such hatred in thy heart? And now, far from restraining the people from rushing to their ruin, shouldst spur them wildly on. For thy own sake, for that of thy country, return to thy senses. It is yet time. But Baldwin, with a clearer comprehension of the honor and interests of the city, which were identical with those of Sicily, answered him indignantly, and neither councillors nor citizens hesitated for a moment whether to prostitute Messina to the stranger, or bid her share the freedom of the sister cities of the island. Rejecting, therefore, these deceptive arguments, Baldwin, in the presence of Matthew de Riso, solemnly renewed his oath to maintain the liberty of Sicily or perish, and exhorted him to join in support of the same sacred cause. In conclusion, he desired him to return to Herbert and offer him security for his own life and that of his soldiers, if, leaving their arms, horses, and accoutrements, they would sail direct for Aigues-Mortes in Provence, binding themselves not to touch anywhere on the Sicilian or other neighboring coasts. The viceroy agreed to these terms, but had no sooner traversed half the strait with 2 vessels than he broke them, and full of hostile designs landed in Calabria in order to join Peter of Catanzaro, who, being advised of what was going forward, had embarked before them with his Calabrians, abandoning his horses and baggage to the fury of the people. Theobald de Messi, castellan of the fortress of Matagrafoni, and Micheletto, with those who had taken refuge at Scaletta, subsequently surrendered with all their followers on the terms granted to the viceroy. The former, having embarked on board a small vessel, set sail several times, but was driven into port by contrary winds or adverse fate. The latter was shut up in the castle, and his soldiers in the palace, to protect them from the fury of the multitude. But these precautions availed not to save them. On the 7th of May, the galleys returned from Palermo, bringing captive with them 2 of those of Amalfi which had accompanied them in the expedition, and the crew, inflamed either by example or indignation at the unnatural and useless attempt in which they had been employed against their fellow countrymen, loudly demanded French blood to slake their thirst for vengeance. The citizens, meanwhile, were no less exasperated by Herbert's breach of faith, so that, as the galley of Natale Pancia, entering the port, grazed the vessel of Theobald de Messi, the crew, on a signal from the shore, sprang upon her deck, seized and bound the prisoners, and flung them overboard to perish. On beholding this spectacle, the former fury blazed up afresh within the city. The mob, rushing to the palace, massacred the soldiers taken at Scaletta. The alarm bells rang. The few partisans of the French concealed themselves in terror. The armed and blood-stained people poured in torrents through the streets. Even the rulers of the city made no attempt to quell their fury, for Nicastro, who undoubtedly shared in their counsels, writes that they, on the contrary, advanced the more boldly in the path of revolution, when they beheld the multitude so inextricably engaged. End of section 36. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Section 37 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6. Edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Expulsion of Jews from England, A.D. 1290, by Henry Hart Milman. Long persecuted in so-called Christian lands, the people without a country, the Jews, first appeared in England during the latter half of the 11th century, a colony, it is said, having been taken from Rowan to London by William the Conqueror. These first comers were, we are told, special favourites of William Rufus. Little is seen of them under Henry I, but in the reign of Stephen they are found established in most of the principal towns, but dwelling as a people apart, not being members of the state, but chattels of the king, and only to be meddled with, for good or for evil, at his bidding. Exempt from taxation and fines, they hoarded wealth, which the king might seize at his pleasure, though none of his subjects could touch it. The Jews' special capacity, in which Christians were forbidden by the Church to employ themselves through fear of the sin of usury, was that of moneylender. In this status, the Jews remained without eventful history until the latter part of the 12th century, when the crusading spirit had aroused a more intense hatred of the race. At the coronation of Richard I, 1189, certain of the Jews intruded among the spectators, causing a riot in which the Jewish quarter was plundered, and this violence was followed by a frenzy of persecution all over the land. A rumour spread that the Jews were accustomed to crucify a Christian boy at Easter, and this aroused the populace to fury against them. Murder and rapine prevailed in several places. 500 Jews, who were allowed to take refuge in the castle at York, were there besieged by the townsmen, in whom no offers of ransom could appease the thirst for blood. These avengers were led on by their own clergy, with the cry, "Destroy the enemies of Christ." A rabbi addressed his countrymen, "Men of Israel, it is better that we should die for our law than to fall into the power of those that hate it, and our law prescribes that we may die by our own hands. Let us voluntarily render up our souls to our Creator." Then all but a few of them burned or buried their effects, and after setting fire to the castle in many places, the men cut the throats of their wives and children, and then their own. Richard I had special dealings with the Jews, the effectual results of which were more securely to bind them as crown chattels and to add to the royal emoluments. King John, well estimating the importance of the Jews as a source of revenue, began his reign by heaping favours upon them, which only made his subjects in general look upon them with more jealousy. Under Henry III, both the wealth of the Jews and the oppressions which laid exactions upon it increased, and during the half-century preceding their expulsion from the realm, their condition, as shown by Milman, became more and more intolerable. Jewish history has a melancholy sameness, perpetual exactions, the means of enforcing them differing only in their degrees of cruelty. Under Henry III, the Parliament of England began, 1250, to consider that these extraordinary succours ought at least to relieve the rest of the nation. They began to inquire into the king's resources from this quarter, and the king consented that one of the 2 justices of the Jews should be appointed by Parliament. But the barons thought more of easing themselves than of protecting the oppressed. In 1256 a demand of 8,000 marks was made, under pain of being transported, some at least of the most wealthy, to Ireland, and, lest they should withdraw their families into places of concealment, they were forbidden, under the penalty of outlawry and confiscation, to remove wife or child from their usual place of residence, for their wives and children were now liable to taxation as well as themselves. During the next 3 years, 60,000 marks more were levied. How, then, was it possible for any traffic, however lucrative, to endure such perpetual exactions? The reason must be found in the enormous interest of money, which seems to have been considered by no means immoderate, at 50%. Certain Oxford scholars thought themselves relieved by being constrained to pay only 2d weekly on a debt of 20 shillings. In fact, the rivalry of more successful usurers seems to have afflicted the Jews more deeply than the exorbitant demands of the king. These were the Caosini, Italian bankers, though named from the town of Cahors, employed by the Pope to collect his revenue. It was the practice of these persons, under the sanction of their principal, to lend money for 3 months without interest, but afterwards to receive 5% monthly till the debt was discharged. The former device was to exempt them from the charge of usury. Henry III at one time attempted to expel this new swarm of locusts, but they asserted their authority from the Pope, and the monarch trembled. Nor were their own body always faithful to the Jews. A certain Abraham, who lived at Berkhamsted and Wallingford, with a beautiful wife who bore the heathen name of Flora, was accused of treating an image of the Virgin with most indecent contumely. He was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, but released, on the intervention of Richard, Earl of Cornwall, on payment of 700 marks. He was a man, it would seem, of infamous character, for his brethren accused him of coining and offered 1,000 marks rather than that he should be released from prison. Richard refused the tempting bribe because Abraham was his Jew. Abraham revenged himself by laying information of plots and conspiracies entered into by the whole people, and the more probable charge of concealment of their wealth from the rapacious hands of the king. This led to a strict and severe investigation of their property. At this investigation was present a wicked and merciless Jew, who rebuked the Christians for their tenderness to his brethren, and reproached the king's officers as gentle and effeminate. He gnashed his teeth, and, as each Jew appeared, declared that he could afford to pay twice as much as was exacted. Though he lied, he was useful in betraying their secret hoards to the king. The distresses of the king increased, and, as his parliament resolutely refused to maintain his extravagant expenditure, nothing remained but to drain still further the veins of the Jews. The office was delegated to Richard, Earl of Cornwall, his brother, whom from his wealth the king might consider possessed of some secret for accumulating riches from hidden sources. The Rabbi Elias was deputed to wait on the prince, expressing the unanimous determination of all the Jews to quit the country rather than submit to further burdens. Their trade was ruined by the Chaosini, the Pope's merchants. The Jews dared not call them usurers, who heaped up masses of gold by their money lending. They could scarcely live on the miserable gains they now obtained. If their eyes were torn out and their bodies flayed, they could not give more. The old man fainted at the close of his speech, and was with difficulty revived. Their departure from the country was a vain boast, for whither should they go? The edicts of the King of France had closed that country against them, and the inhospitable world scarcely afforded a place of refuge. Earl Richard treated them with leniency and accepted a small sum. But the next year the king renewed his demands. His declaration affected no disguise. "It is dreadful to imagine the debts to which I am bound. By the face of God, they amount to 200,000 marks. If I should say 300,000, I should not go beyond the truth. Money I must have, from any place, from any person, or by any means." The king's acts display as little dignity as his proclamation. He actually sold or mortgaged to his brother Richard all the Jews in the realm for 5,000 marks, giving him full power over their property and persons. Our records still preserve the terms of this extraordinary bargain and sale. Popular opinion, which in the worst times is some restraint upon the arbitrary oppression of kings, in this case would rather applaud the utmost barbarity of the monarch than commiserate the wretchedness of the victims. For a new tale of the crucifixion of a Christian child, called Hugh of Lincoln, was now spreading horror throughout the country. The fact was confirmed by a solemn trial and the conviction and execution of the criminals. It was proved, according to the mode of proof in those days, that the child had been stolen, fattened on bread and milk for 10 days, and crucified with all the cruelties and insults of Christ's passion, in the presence of all the Jews in England, summoned to Lincoln for this especial purpose. A Jew of Lincoln sat in judgment as Pilate, but the earth could not endure to be an accomplice in the crime. It cast up the buried remains, and the affrighted criminals were obliged to throw the body into a well, where it was found by the mother. A great part of this story refutes itself, but among the ignorant and fanatic Jews there might be some who, exasperated by the constant repetition of this charge, might brood over it so long as at length to be tempted to its perpetration. I must not suppress the fearful vengeance wreaked on the supposed perpetrators of this all-execrated crime. The Jew into whose house the child, it was said, had gone to play, tempted by the promise of life and security from mutilation, made full confession, and threw the guilt upon his brethren. The king, indignant at this unauthorized covenant of mercy, ordered him to execution. The Jew, in his despair or frenzy, entered into a still more minute and terrible denunciation of all the Jews of the realm as consenting to the act. He was dragged, tied to a horse's tail, to the gallows, his body and his soul delivered to the demons of the air. 91 Jews of Lincoln were sent to London as accomplices and thrown into dungeons. If some Christians felt pity for their sufferings, their rivals, the Chaosini, beheld them with dry eyes. The king's inquest declared all the Jews of the realm guilty of the crime. The mother made her appeal to the king. 18 of the richest and most eminent of the Lincoln Jews were hung on a new gallows. 20 more were imprisoned in the Tower, awaiting the same fate. But if the Jews of Lincoln were thus terribly chastised, the Church of Lincoln was enriched and made famous for centuries. The victim was canonized. Pilgrims crowded from all parts of the kingdom, even from foreign lands, to pay their devotions at the shrine, to witness and to receive benefit from the miracles which were wrought by the martyr of 8 years old. How deeply this legend sank into the popular mind may be conceived from Chaucer's Prioress's Tale. The rest of the reign of Henry III passed away with the same unmitigated oppressions of the Jews, which the Jews, no doubt, in some degree, revenged by their extortions from the people. The contest between the royal and ecclesiastical jurisdiction over the Jews was arranged by certain constitutions set forth by the king in council. By these laws, no Jew could reside in the kingdom but as king's serf. Service was to be performed in the synagogue in a low tone, so as not to offend the ears of Christians. The Jews were forbidden to have Christian nurses for their children. The other clauses were similar to those enacted in other countries, that the Jews should pay all dues to the parson. No Jew should eat or buy meat during Lent. All disputes on religion were forbidden. Sexual intercourse between Jews and Christians interdicted. No Jew might settle in any town where Jews were not accustomed to reside, without special license from the king. The barons' wars drew on, fatal to the Israelites as compelling the king, by the hopeless state of his finances, to new extortions, and tempting the barons to plunder and even murder them as wickedly and unconstitutionally attached to the king. How they passed back from Richard of Cornwall into the king's jurisdiction as property appears not. It is not likely that the king redeemed the mortgage, but in 1261 they were again alienated to Prince Edward. The king's object was apparently by this and other gifts to withdraw the prince from his alliance with the barons. The justiciaries of the Jews are now in abeyance. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was to seal ale writs of Judaism and account to the attorneys of the prince for the amount. But this was not the worst of their sufferings or the bitterest disgrace. The prince in his turn mortgaged them to certain of their dire enemies, the Chaosini, and the king ratified the assignment by his royal authority. But for this compulsory aid, wrung from them by violence, the Jews were treated by the barons as allies and accomplices of the king. When London, at least her turbulent mayor and the populace, declared for the barons, when the Grand Justiciary, Hugh le Despencer, led the city bands to destroy the palaces of the King of the Romans at Westminster and Isleworth, threw the justices of the King's Bench and the barons of the Exchequer into prison, and seized the property of the foreign merchants, 500 of the Jews, men, women, and children, were apprehended and set apart, but not for security. Despencer chose some of the richest in order to extort a ransom for his own people. The rest were plundered, stripped, murdered by the merciless rabble. Old men and babes plucked from their mothers' breasts were pitilessly slaughtered. It was on Good Friday that one of the fiercest of the barons, Fitzjohn, put to death Koch ben Abraham, reputed to have been the wealthiest man in the kingdom, seized his property, but, fearful of the jealousy of the other barons, surrendered one half of the plunder to Leicester in order to secure his own portion. The Jews of other cities fared no better, were pillaged and then abandoned to the mob by the Earl of Gloucester. Many at Worcester were plundered and forced to submit to baptism by the Earl of Derby. At an earlier period, the Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort, had expelled them from the town of Leicester. They sought refuge in the domains of the Countess of Winchester. Robert Grotet, the wisest and best churchman of the day, then Archdeacon of Leicester, hardly permitted the Countess to harbour this accursed race. Their lives might be spared, but all further indulgence, especially acceptance of their ill-gotten wealth, would make her an accomplice in the wickedness of their usuries. After the Battle of Lewes, 1264, the king, with the advice of his barons, he was now a prisoner in their camp, issued a proclamation to the Lord Mayor and Sheriffs of London in favour of the Jews. Some had found refuge, during the tumult and massacre, in the Tower of London. They were permitted to return with their families to their homes. All ill usage or further molestation was prohibited under pain of death. Orders of the same kind were issued to Lincoln. 25 citizens were named by the king and the barons their special protectors, so also to Northampton. The king, Prince Edward was now at war with the barons, who had the king in their power, revoked the grant of the Jews to his son. With that, the grant to the Chaosini, which had not expired, was cancelled. The justiciaries appointed by the prince to levy the tallage upon them were declared to have lost their authority. The Jews passed back to the property of the king. The king showed his power by annulling many debts and the interest due upon them to some of his faithful followers, avowedly in order to secure their attachment. It was now clearly for the king's interest that such profitable subjects should find, we may not say justice, but something like restitution, which might enable them again to become profitable. The king in the Parliament, which commenced its sittings immediately after the Battle of Lewes, and continued till after the Battle of Evesham, August the 4th, 1265, restored the Jews to the same state in which they were before the Battle of Lewes. As to the Jews in London, the Constable of the Tower was to see not only that those who had taken refuge in the Tower, but those who had fled to other places were to return to their houses, which were to be restored, except such as had been granted away by the king, and even all their property which could be recovered from the king's enemies. Excepting that some of the barons' troops, flying from the Battle of Evesham under the younger Simon de Montfort, broke open and plundered the synagogue at Lincoln, where they found much wealth and some excesses committed at Cambridge, the Jews had time to breathe. The king, enriched by the forfeited estates of the barons, spared the Jews. We only find a tallage of £1,000, with promise of exemption for 3 years, unless the king or his son should undertake a crusade. Their wrongs had, no doubt, sunk deep into the hearts of the Jews. It has been observed that oppression, which drives even wise men mad, may instigate fanatics to the wildest acts of frenzy. An incident at Oxford will illustrate this. Throughout these times the Jews still flourished, if they may be said to have flourished, at Oxford. In 1244 certain clerks of the university broke into the houses of the Jews and carried away enormous wealth. The magistrates seized and imprisoned some of the offenders. Grotet, as bishop of the diocese, Oxford was then in the diocese of Lincoln, commanded their release, because there was no proof of felony against them. We hear nothing of restitution. The scholars might indeed hate the Jews, whose interest on loans was limited by Bishop Grotet to 2d. weekly in the pound, between 40 and 50%. Probably the poor scholar's security was not over good. Later, the studies in the university are said to have been interrupted, the scholars being unable to redeem their books pledged to the Jews. 24 years after the outbreak of the scholars, years of bitterness and spoliation and suffering, while the Chancellor and the whole body of the university were in solemn procession to the relics of St. Fryswide, they were horror-struck by beholding a Jew rush forth, seize the cross which was borne before them, dash it to the ground, and trample upon it with the most furious contempt. The offender seems to have made his escape in the tumult, but his people suffered for his crime. Prince Edward was then at Oxford, and by the royal decree the Jews were imprisoned and forced, notwithstanding much artful delay on their part, to erect a beautiful cross of white marble, with an image of the Virgin and Child, gilt all over, in the area of Merton College, and to present to the proctors another cross of silver to be borne at all future processions of the university. The Jews endeavoured to elude this penalty by making over their effects to other persons. The king empowered the sheriff to levy the fine on all their property. The last solemn act of Henry of Winchester was a statute of great importance. Complaints had arisen that the Jews, by purchase, or probably foreclosure of mortgage, might become possessed of all the rights of lords of manors, escheat wardships, even of presentation to churches. They might hold entire baronies with all their appurtenances. The whole was swept away by one remorseless clause. The act disqualified the Jews altogether from holding lands or even tenements, except the houses of which they were actually possessed, where they might only pull down and rebuild on the old foundations. All lands or manors were actually taken away. Those which they held by mortgage were to be restored to the Christian owners, without any interest on such bonds. Henry almost died in the act of extortion. He had ordered the arrears of all charges to be peremptorily paid, under pain of imprisonment. Such was the distress caused by this inexorable mandate that even the rival bankers, the Chaosini, and the friars themselves were moved to commiseration, though some complained that the wild outcries raised in the synagogue on this doleful occasion disturbed the devotion of the Christians in the neighbouring churches. The death of Henry released the Jews from this Egyptian bondage, but they changed their master, not their fortune. The first act of Edward's reign after his return from the Holy Land regulated the affairs of the Jews exactly in the same spirit. A new tallage was demanded, which was to extend to the women and children. The penalty of non-payment, even of arrears, was exile, not imprisonment. The defaulter was to proceed immediately to Dover with his wife and children, leaving his house and property to the use of the king. The execution of this edict was committed not to the ordinary civil authorities, but to an Irish bishop elect and to 2 friars. This edict was followed up by the celebrated Act of Parliament concerning Judaism, the object of which seems to have been the same with the policy of Louis IX of France, to force the Jews to abandon usury and to betake themselves to traffic, manufactures, or the cultivation of land. It positively prohibited all usury and cancelled all debts on payment of the principal. No Jew might distress beyond the moiety of a Christian's land and goods. They were to wear their badge, a badge now of yellow, not white, and pay an Easter offering of 3d, men and women, to the king. They were permitted to practise merchandise or labour with their hands, and, some of them, it seems, were still addicted to husbandry, to hire farms for cultivation for 15 years. On these terms they were assured of the royal protection. But manual labour and traffic were not sources sufficiently expeditious for the enterprising avarice of the Jews. Many of them, thus reduced, took again to a more unlawful and dangerous occupation, clipping and adulterating the coin. In one day, November the 17th, 1279, all the Jews in the kingdom were arrested. In London alone, 280 were executed after a full trial, many more in other parts of the kingdom. A vast quantity of clipped coin was found and confiscated to the king's use. The king granted their estates and forfeitures with lavish hand. But law, though merciless and probably not over-scrupulous in the investigation of crime, did not satisfy the popular passions, which had been let loose by these wide and general accusations. The populace took the law into their own hands. Everywhere there was full licence for plunder and worse than plunder. The king was obliged to interpose. A writ was issued, addressed to the justiciaries who had presided at the trials for the adulteration of the coin, Peter of Pentester, Walter of Heylin, John of Cobham, appointed justiciaries for the occasion. It recited that many Jews had been indicted and legally condemned to death and to the forfeiture of their goods and chattels, but that certain Christians, solely on account of religious differences, were raising up false and frivolous charges against men who had not been legally arraigned, in order to extort money from them by fear. No Jew against whom a legal indictment had not been issued before May 1st, 1280, was to be molested or subject to accusation. Those only arrested on grave suspicion before that time were to be put upon their trial. Jewish tradition attributes the final expulsion of the Jews to these charges, which the king, it avers, did not believe, yet was compelled to yield to popular clamour. But not all the statutes, nor public executions, nor the active preaching of the Dominican friars, who undertook to convert them if they were constrained to hear their sermons, the king's bailiffs, on the petition of the friars, were ordered to induce the Jews to become quiet, meek, and uncontentious hearers, could either alter the Jewish character, still patient of all evil, so that they could extort wealth, or suppress the still increasing clamour of public detestation, which demanded that the land should cast forth from its indignant bosom this irreclaimable race of rapacious infidels. Still worse, if we may trust a papal bull, the presence and intercourse of the Jews were dangerous to the religion of England. In the year 1286, the Pope, Honorius IV, addressed a bull to the Archbishop of Canterbury and his suffragans, rebuking them for the remissness of the clergy in not watching more closely the proceedings of the Jews. The Archbishop, indeed, had not been altogether so neglectful in the duty of persecution. The number and the splendour of the synagogues in London had moved the indignation, perhaps the jealousy, of Primate Peckham. He issued his monition to the Bishop of London to inhibit the building any more of these offensively sumptuous edifices, and to compel the Jews to destroy those built within a prescribed time. The zeal of the Bishop of London, Robert de Gravesend, outran that of the Archbishop. He ordered them all to be levelled to the ground. The Archbishop, prevailed on by the urgent supplications of the Jews, graciously informed the Bishop that he might conscientiously allow one synagogue if that synagogue did not wound the eyes of pious Christians by its magnificence. But the bull of Honorius IV was something more than a stern condemnation of the usurious and extortionate practices of the Jews. It was a complaint of their progress, not merely in inducing Jewish converts to Christianity to apostatize back to Judaism, but of their not unsuccessful endeavours to tempt Christians to Judaism. These Jews lure them to their synagogues on the Sabbath. Are we to suppose that there was something splendid and attractive in the synagogue worship of the day? And in their friendly intercourse at common banquets, the souls of Christians, softened by wine and good eating and social enjoyment, are endangered. The Talmud of the Jews, which they still persist in studying, is especially denounced as full of abomination, falsehood, and infidelity. The king at length listened to the public voice, and the irrevocable edict of total expulsion from the realm was issued. Their whole property was seized at once, and just money enough left to discharge their expenses to foreign lands, perhaps equally inhospitable. The 10th of October was the fatal day. The king benignantly allowed them till All Saints' Day, after which all who delayed were to be hanged without mercy. The king, in the execution of this barbarous proceeding, put on the appearance both of religion and moderation. Safe conducts were to be granted to the seashore from all parts of the kingdom. The wardens of the Cinque Ports were to provide shipping and receive the exiles with civility and kindness. The king expressed his intention of converting great part of his gains to pious uses, but the church looked in vain for the fulfilment of his vows. He issued orders that the Jews should be treated with kindness and courtesy on their journey to the seashore. But where the prince by his laws thus gave countenance to the worst passions of human nature, it was not likely that they would be suppressed by his proclamations. The Jews were pursued from the kingdom with every mark of popular triumph in their sufferings. One man, indeed, the master of a vessel at Queenborough, was punished for leaving a considerable number on the shore at the mouth of the river, when, as they prayed to him to rescue them from their perilous situation, he answered that they had better call on Moses, who had made them pass safe through the Red Sea, and sailing away with their remaining property, left them to their fate. The number of exiles is variously estimated at 15,060 and 16,511. All their property, debts, obligation, mortgages, escheated to the king. Yet some, even in those days, presumed to doubt whether the nation gained by the act of expulsion, and even ventured to assert that the public burdens on the Christians only became heavier and more intolerable. Catholics suffered in the place of the enemies of the cross of Christ. The loss to the crown was enormous. The convents made themselves masters of the valuable libraries of the Jews, one at Stanford, another at Oxford, from which the celebrated Roger Bacon is said to have derived great information, and long after, the common people would dig in the places they had frequented, in hopes of finding buried treasure. End of section 37.
Section 38 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rowan Puttergill. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Exploits and Death of William Wallace, the Hero of Scotland, AD 1297 to 1305, Sir Walter Scott. When the granddaughter and sole heiress of King Alexander III of Scotland was betrothed in her 6th year 1288 to the son of Edward I of England, an early union of the English and Scottish crowns seemed assured. But the death of the little princess 2 years later left the throne of Scotland vacant, and was followed by the rise of 13 claimants, 3 of whom were entitled to serious regard: John de Balliol, Lord of Galloway, Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale, and John Hastings, Lord of Abergavenny, all descended from David, brother of William the Lion, King of Scotland, 1165 to 1214. Edward I of England at once assumed all the rights of a feudal suzerain until the disputed claims should be settled. Finally, the claim of Balliol was recognized. He did homage to Edward for his services to the realm of Scotland, and for a time peace prevailed. But when Edward called upon the Scottish nobles to serve in his foreign wars, and made other demands implying the dependence of Scotland, the resentment of Balliol's subjects forced him into an attitude of war. In 1295 he made an alliance against Edward with Philip the Fair of France. In 1296 Edward invaded Scotland, took Berwick, and slaughtered 8,000 of its citizens, defeated the Scots at Dunbar, occupied Edinburgh, Stirling, and Perth, compelled Balliol to surrender, and sent him to the Tower of London. Edward then made Scotland a dependency of his crown. This submission was not the act of the people, but of their leaders. The Scots assembled in troops and companies, and betaking themselves to the woods, mountains, and morasses, prepared for a general insurrection against the English power. They found their leader in the outlawed knight, William Wallace. Wallace was born about 1274. Popular tradition, which delights to dwell upon the beloved champion of the people, has invested him with many striking qualities, ascribing to him a gigantic stature and enormous strength, as well as extraordinary courage. Little, if anything, is really known of his personality and private life, while all that belongs to history concerning him is told by his celebrated and admiring fellow countryman, Sir Walter Scott, in the following narrative. Wallace is believed to have been proclaimed an outlaw for the slaughter of an Englishman in a casual fray. He retreated to the woods, collected around him a band of men as desperate as himself, and obtained several successes in skirmishes with the English. Joined by Sir William Douglas, who had been taken at the siege of Berwick, but had been discharged upon ransom, the insurgents compelled Edward to send an army against them under the Earl of Surrey, the victor of Dunbar. Several of the nobility, moved by Douglas's example, had joined Wallace's standard, but overawed at the approach of the English army, and displeased to act under a man like Wallace, of comparatively obscure birth, they capitulated with Sir Henry Percy, the nephew of Surrey, and in one word changed sides. Wallace kept the field at the head of a considerable army, partly consisting of his own experienced followers, partly of the smaller barons or crown tenants, and partly of vassals, even of the apostate lords, and volunteers of every condition. By the exertion of much conduct and resolution, Wallace had made himself master of the country beyond Forth, and taken several castles when he was summoned to Stirling to oppose Surrey, the English governor of Scotland. Wallace encamped on the northern side of the river, leaving Stirling Bridge apparently open to the English, but resolving, as it was long and narrow, to attack them while in the act of crossing. The Earl of Surrey led 50,000 infantry and 1,000 men-at-arms. Part of his soldiers, however, were the Scottish barons who had formerly joined Wallace's standard, and who, notwithstanding their return to that of Surrey, were scarcely to be trusted. The English treasurer, Cressingham, murmured at the expense attending the war, and to bring it to a crisis proposed to commence an attack the next morning by crossing the river. Surrey, an experienced warrior, hesitated to engage his troops in the defile of a wooden bridge where scarce 2 horsemen could ride abreast, but urged by the imprudent vehemence of Cressingham, he advanced contrary to common sense as well as to his own judgment. The vanguard of the English was attacked before they could get into order. The bridge was broken down and thousands perished in the river and by the sword. Cressingham was slain, and Surrey fled to Berwick to recount to Edward that Scotland was lost at Stirling in as short a time as it had been won at Dunbar. In a brief period after this victory, almost all the fortresses of the kingdom surrendered to Wallace. Increasing his forces, Wallace, that he might gratify them with plunder, led them across the English border, and sweeping it lengthwise from Newcastle to the gates of Carlisle, left nothing behind him but blood and ashes. The nature of Wallace was fierce, but not inaccessible to pity or remorse. As his unruly soldiers pillaged the church of Hexham, he took the canons under his immediate protection. "Abide with me," he said, "holy men, for my people are evildoers, and I may not correct them." When he returned from this successful foray, an assembly of the states was held at the Forest Church in Selkirkshire, where Wallace was chosen guardian of the kingdom of Scotland. The meeting was attended by Lennox, Sir William Douglas, and some few men of rank. Others were absent from fear of King Edward, or from jealousy of an inferior person like Wallace, raised to so high a station. Conscious of the interest which he had deservedly maintained in the breast of the universal people of Scotland, Wallace pursued his judicious plans of enforcing general levies through the kingdom and bringing them under discipline. It was full time, for Edward was moving against them. The English monarch was absent in Flanders when these events took place, and what was still more inconvenient, before he could gain supplies from his parliament to suppress the Scottish revolt, Edward found himself obliged to confirm Magna Carta, the Charter of the Forest, and other stipulations in favour of the people, the English being prudent, though somewhat selfishly disposed to secure their own freedom before they would lend their swords to destroy that of their neighbours. Complying with these demands, Edward, on his return from the Low Countries, found himself at the head of a gallant muster of all the English chivalry, forming by far the most superb army that had ever entered Scotland. Wallace acted with great sagacity, and according to a plan which often before and after proved successful in Scottish warfare, laid waste the intermediate country between Stirling and the frontiers, and withdrew toward the centre of the kingdom to receive the English attack when their army should be exhausted by privation. Edward pressed on with characteristic hardihood and resolution. Tower and town fell before him, but his advance was not without such inconvenience and danger as a less determined monarch would have esteemed a good apology for retreat. His army suffered from want of provisions, which were at length supplied in small quantities by some of his ships. As the English king lay at Kirkliston in West Lothian, a tumult broke out between the Welsh and English in his army, which after costing some blood was quelled with difficulty. While Edward hesitated whether to advance or retreat, he learned through the treachery of 2 apostate Scottish nobles
the Earls of Dunbar and Angus, that Wallace with the Scottish army had approached so near as Falkirk. This advance was doubtless made with the purpose of annoying the expected retreat of the English. Edward, thus apprised that the Scots were in his vicinity, determined to compel them to action. He broke up his camp, and advancing with caution, slept the next night in the fields along with the soldiers. But the casualties of the campaign were not yet exhausted. His war horse, which was picketed beside him like that of an ordinary man-at-arms, struck the king with his foot and hurt him in his side. A tumult arose in the camp, but Edward, regardless of pain, appeased it by mounting his horse, riding through the cantonments, and showing the soldiers that he was in safety. Next morning, July 22nd, 1298, the armies met. The Scottish infantry were drawn up on a moor with a morass in front. They were divided into 4 phalanxes, or dense masses, with lances lowered obliquely over each other, and seeming, says an English historian, like a castle walled with steel. These spearmen were the flower of the army, in whom Wallace chiefly confided. He commanded them in person and used a brief exhortation. "I have brought you to the ring. Dance as best you can." The Scottish archers, under the command of Sir John Stewart, brother of the Steward of Scotland, were drawn up in the intervals between the masses of infantry. They were chiefly brought from the wooded district of Selkirk. We hear of no Highland bowmen among them. The cavalry, which amounted to only 1,000 men-at-arms, held the rear. The English cavalry began the action. The Marshal of England led half of the men-at-arms straight upon the Scottish front, but in doing so involved them in the morass. The Bishop of Durham, who commanded the other division of the English cavalry, was wheeling round the morass on the east, and perceiving this misfortune, became disposed to wait for support. "To mass, Bishop," said Rolf Bassett of Drayton, and charged with the whole body. The Scottish men-at-arms went off without couching their lances, but the infantry stood their ground firmly. In the turmoil that followed, Sir John Stewart fell from his horse, and was slain among the archers of Ettrick, who died in defending or avenging him. The close bodies of Scottish spearmen, now exposed without means of defence or retaliation, were shaken by the constant showers of arrows, and the English men-at-arms, finally charging them desperately while they were in disorder, broke and dispersed these formidable masses. The Scots were then completely routed, and it was only the neighbouring woods which saved a remnant from the sword. The body of Stewart was found among those of his faithful archers, who were distinguished by their stature and fair complexions from all others with which the field was loaded. Macduff and Sir John Graham, the hardy Wight and Wise, still fondly remembered as the bosom friend of Sir William Wallace, were slain in the same disastrous action. Popular report states this battle to have been lost by treachery, and the communications between the Earls of Dunbar and Angus and King Edward, as well as the disgraceful flight of the Scottish cavalry without a single blow, corroborates the suspicion. But the great superiority of the English in archery may account for the loss of this as of many other battle on the part of the Scots. The bowmen of Ettrick Forest were faithful, but they could only be few. So nearly had Wallace's scheme for the campaign been successful that Edward, even after having gained this battle, returned to England and deferred reaping the harvest of his conquest till the following season. If he had not been able to bring the Scottish army to action, his retreat must have been made with discredit and loss, and Scotland must have been left in the power of the patriots. The slaughter and disgrace of the Battle of Falkirk might have been repaired in other respects, but it cost the Scottish kingdom an irredeemable loss in the public services of Wallace. He resigned the guardianship of the kingdom, unable to discharge its duties amid the calumnies with which faction and envy aggravated his defeat. The Bishop of St. Andrews, Bruce, Earl of Carrick, and Sir John Comyn were chosen guardians of Scotland, which they administered in the name of Balliol. In the meantime, that unfortunate prince was in compassion or scorn delivered up to the Pope by Edward, and a receipt was gravely taken for his person from the nuncio then in France. This led to the entrance of a new competitor for the Scottish kingdom. The Pontiff of Rome had been long endeavouring to establish a claim to whatsoever should be therein found, to which a distinct and specific right of property could not be ascertained. The Pontiff's claim to the custody of the dethroned king being readily admitted, Boniface VIII was encouraged to publish a bull claiming Scotland as a dependency on the See of Rome, because the country had been converted to Christianity by the relics of St. Andrew. The Pope, in the same document, took the claim of Edward to the Scottish crown under his own discussion, and authoritatively commanded Edward I to send proctors to Rome to plead his cause before His Holiness. The magisterial requisition was presented by the Archbishop of Canterbury to the king, in the presence of the council and court, the prelate at the same time warning the sovereign to yield unreserved obedience, since Jerusalem would not fail to protect her citizens and Mount Zion her worshippers. "Neither for Zion nor Jerusalem," said Edward in towering wrath, "will I depart from my just rights while there is breath in my nostrils." Accordingly, he caused the Pope's bull to be laid before the Parliament of England, who unanimously resolved that in temporals the King of England was independent of Rome, and that they would not permit his sovereignty to be questioned. Their declaration concludes with these remarkable words: "We neither do, will, nor can permit our sovereign to do anything to the detriment of the Constitution which we are both sworn to and are determined to maintain." A spirited assertion of national right, had it not been in so bad a cause as that of Edward's claim of usurpation over Scotland. Meantime, the war languished during this strange discussion, from which the Pope was soon obliged to retreat. There was an inefficient campaign in 1299 and 1300. In 1301 there was a truce in which Scotland as well as France was included. After the expiry of this breathing space, Edward I, in the spring of 1302, sent an army into Scotland of 20,000 men under Sir John Seward, a renowned general. He marched toward Edinburgh in 3 divisions, leaving large intervals between each. While in this careless order, Seward's vanguard found themselves suddenly within reach of a small but chosen body of troops amounting to 8,000 men, commanded by Sir John Comyn, the Guardian, and a gallant Scottish knight, Sir Simon Fraser. Seward was defeated, but the battle was scarce over when his 2nd division came up. The Scots, flushed with victory, re-established their ranks, and having cruelly put to death their prisoners, attacked and defeated the 2nd body also. The 3rd division came up in the same manner. Again it became necessary to kill the captives and to prepare for a 3rd encounter. The Scottish leaders did so without hesitation, and their followers, having thrown themselves furiously on the enemy, discomfited that division likewise, and gained, as the historians boast, 3 battles in one day. But the period seemed to be approaching in which neither courage nor exertion could longer avail the unfortunate people of Scotland. A peace with France, in which Philip the Fair totally omitted all stipulations in favour of his allies, left the kingdom to its own inadequate means of resistance, while Edward directed his whole force against it. The castle of Brechin, under the gallant Sir Thomas More, made an obstinate resistance. He was mortally wounded and died in an exclamation of rage against the soldiers, who asked if they might not then surrender the castle. Edward wintered at Dunfermline, and began the next campaign with the siege of Stirling, the only fortress in the kingdom that still held out. But the courage of the Guardians altogether gave way. They set the example of submission, and such of them as had been most obstinate in what the English king called rebellion were punished by various degrees of fine and banishment. With respect to Sir William Wallace, it was agreed that he might have the choice of surrendering himself unconditionally to the king's pleasure, provided he thought proper to do so, a stipulation which, as it signified nothing in favour of the person for whom it was apparently conceived, must be imputed as a pretext on the part of the Scottish nobles to save themselves from the disgrace of having left Wallace altogether unthought of. Some attempts were made to ascertain what sort of accommodation Edward was likely to enter into with the bravest and most constant of his enemies, but the demands of Wallace were large, and the generosity of Edward very small. The English king broke off the treaty, and put a price of 300 marks on the head of the patriot. Meantime, Stirling Castle continued to be defended by a slender garrison, and deprived of all hopes of relief, continued to make a desperate defence under its brave governor, Sir William Oliphant, until famine and despair compelled him to an unconditional surrender, when the king imposed the harshest of terms on this handful of brave men. But what Edward prized more than the surrender of the last fortress which resisted his arms in Scotland was the captivity of her last patriot. He found in a Scottish nobleman, Sir John Monteith, a person willing to become his agent in searching for Wallace among the wilds where he was driven to find refuge. Wallace was finally betrayed to the English by his unworthy and apostate countrymen, who obtained an opportunity of seizing him at Rob Royston, near Glasgow, by the treachery of a servant. Sir William Wallace was instantly transferred to London, where he was brought to trial in Westminster Hall, with as much apparatus of infamy as the ingenuity of his enemies could devise. He was crowned with a garland of oak to intimate that he had been king of outlaws. The arraignment charged him with high treason in respect that he had stormed and taken towns and castles and shed much blood. "Traitor," said Wallace, "was I never." The rest of the charges he confessed, and proceeded to justify them. He was condemned and executed by decapitation, 1305. His head was placed on a pinnacle on London Bridge, and his quarters were distributed over the kingdom. Thus died this courageous patriot, leaving a remembrance which will be immortal in the hearts of his countrymen. This steady champion of independence having been removed, and a bloody example held out to all who should venture to tread in his footsteps, Edward proceeded to form a species of constitution for the country, which at the cost of so much labour, policy, and bloodshed, he had at length, as he conceived, united forever with the English crown. 10 commissioners, chosen for Scotland and 20 for England, composed a set of regulations for the administration of justice, and enactments were agreed upon by which the feudal law, which had been long introduced into Scotland, was strengthened and extended, while the remains of the ancient municipal customs of the original Celtic tribes, or the constitutionary laws of the Scots and Brets, the Scoto-Irish and British races, were finally abrogated. This was for the purpose of promoting a uniformity of laws through the islands. Sheriffs and other officers were appointed for the administration of justice. There were provisions also made for a general revision of the ancient laws and statutes of Scotland. End of section 38.
Section 39 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. First Great Jubilee of the Roman Catholic Church, A.D. 1300. By Ferdinand Gregorovius. Benedetto Gaetani, born at Anagni, Italy, about 1228, whom contemporary poets and historians also consign to infamy, occupied the pontifical throne but 10 years, from 1294 until 1303, but those were years of almost continual strife. It is indeed likely that partisanship painted him, in some respects, with colors too black, attributing to him crimes of which he was not guilty. But even these exaggerations of dispraise were due to the unquestioned facts of his character and career. When at length Boniface was worsted in his quarrel with Philip the Fair, a widespread reaction began on the part of the laity against ecclesiastical assumptions, and the great dramatic act by which, under Hildebrand, the papacy first displayed its power had its counterpart in the manner of its decline. The drama of Anagni is to be set against the drama of Canossa. But Boniface enjoyed 1 year of triumph scarcely paralleled in all the experience of his fellow pontiffs. This was the closing year of the 13th century. Taking advantage of a fresh wave of religious enthusiasm which then swept over Europe, the Pope called upon the Christian world, almost at peace from long warfare, to celebrate a Jubilee. The institution of the Catholic Jubilee is generally considered as dating from this celebration, though some writers refer its establishment to the pontificate of Innocent III, a century earlier. Boniface VIII inaugurated the 14th century with a pilgrimage festival which has become renowned. The centennial Jubilee had been celebrated in ancient Rome by magnificent games. The recollections of these games, however, had expired, and no tidings inform us whether the close or beginning of a century was marked in Christian Rome by any ecclesiastical festival. The immense processions of pilgrims to St. Peter's had ceased during the Crusades. The Crusades ended, the old longing reawoke among the people and drew them again to the graves of the apostles. The pious impulse was fostered in no small degree by the shrewdness of the Roman priests. About the Christmas of 1299, and with Christmas according to the style of the Roman Curia, the year ended, crowds flocked both from the city and country to St. Peter's. A cry promising remission of sins to those who made the pilgrimage to Rome resounded throughout the world and forced it into movement. Boniface gave form and sanction to the growing impulse by promulgating the Bull of Jubilee on February 22, 1300, which promised remission of sins to all who should visit the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul during the year. The pilgrimage of Italians was to last for 30 days, that of foreigners for 15. The enemies of the Church were alone excluded. As such, the Pope designated Frederick of Sicily, the Colonnas and their adherents, and, curiously enough, all Christians who held traffic with Saracens. Boniface consequently made use of the Jubilee to brand his enemies and to exclude them from the privileges of Christian grace. The pressure toward Rome was unexampled. The city presented the aspect of a camp where crowds of pilgrims, that resembled armies, thronged incessantly in and out. A spectator standing on one of the heights of the city might have seen swarms like wandering tribes approach along the ancient Roman roads from north, south, east, and west, and had he mixed among them, might have had difficulty in discovering their home. Italians, Provençals, Frenchmen, Hungarians, Slavs, Germans, Spaniards, even Englishmen came. Italy gave free passage to pilgrims and kept the truce of God. The crowds arrived, wearing the pilgrim's mantle or clad in their national dress, on foot, on horseback, or on cars, leading the ill and weary and laden with their luggage. Veterans of 100 were led by their grandsons, and youths bore, like Aeneas, father or mother on their shoulders. They spoke in many dialects, but they all sang in the same language, the litanies of the Church, and their longing dreams had but one and the same object. On beholding in the sunny distance the dark forest of towers of the holy city, they raised the exultant shout, "Rome, Rome," like sailors who, after a tedious voyage, catch their first glimpse of land. They threw themselves down in prayer and rose again with a fervent cry, "St. Peter and St. Paul, have mercy." They were received at the gates by their countrymen, and by guardians appointed by the city to show them their quarters. Nevertheless, they first made their way to St. Peter's, ascended the steps of the vestibule on their knees, and then threw themselves in ecstasies on the grave of the apostle. During an entire year Rome swarmed with pilgrims, and was filled with a perfect Babel of tongues. It was said that 30,000 pilgrims entered and left the city daily, and that daily 200,000 pilgrims might have been found within it. An exemplary administration provided for order and for moderate prices. The year was fruitful. The Campagna and the neighboring provinces sent supplies in abundance. One of the pilgrims, who was a chronicler, relates that bread, wine, meat, fish, and oats were plentiful and cheap in the market, The hay, however, was very dear, the inn so expensive that I was obliged to pay for my bed and the stabling of my horse, beyond the hay and oats, a tournee's groat a day. As I left Rome on Christmas Eve, I saw so large a party of pilgrims depart that no one could count the number. The Romans reckon that altogether they have had 2 millions of men and women. I frequently saw both sexes trodden under foot, and it was sometimes with difficulty that I escaped the same fate myself. The way that led from the city across the bridge of St. Angelo to St. Peter's was too narrow. A new street was therefore opened in the walls along the river, not far from the ancient tomb known as Meta Romuli. The bridge was covered with booths which divided it in two, and in order to prevent accidents it was enacted that those going to St. Peter's should keep to one side of the bridge, those returning to the other. Processions went incessantly to St. Paul's without the walls, and to St. Peter's, where the already renowned relic, the handkerchief of Veronica, was exhibited. Every pilgrim laid an offering on the altar of the apostle, and the same chronicler of Este assures us, as an eye-witness, that 2 clerics stood by the altar of St. Paul's day and night, who with rakes in their hands gathered in untold money. The marvelous sight of priests who smilingly shoveled up gold like hay caused malicious Ghibellines to assert that the Pope had appointed the Jubilee solely for the sake of gain. Boniface, in truth, stood in need of money to defray the expenses of the war with Sicily, which swallowed up incalculable sums. If instead of copper the monks in St. Paul's had lighted on gold florins, they would necessarily have collected fabulous wealth. But the heaps of money, both in St. Peter's and St. Paul's, consisted mainly of small coins, the gifts of poor pilgrims. Cardinal Jacopo Stefanecci pointedly comments on the fact and laments the change of times when only the poor gave offerings, and when kings no longer, like the 3 Magi, brought gifts to the Saviour. The receipts of the Jubilee, which the Pope was able to devote to the 2 basilicas for the purchase of estates, were sufficiently considerable. If in ordinary years the gifts of pilgrims to St. Peter's amounted to 30,400 gold florins, we may conclude how much greater must have been the gains of the year of Jubilee. The gifts of pilgrims, wrote the chronicler of Florence, yield treasures to the church, and the Romans all grow wealthy by the sale of their goods. The year of Jubilee was for them indeed a year of wealth. The Romans, therefore, treated the pilgrims with kindness, and nothing is heard of any act of violence. If the fall of the house of Colonna had aroused enemies to the Pope in Rome, he disarmed them by the immense profits which accrued to the Romans, who have always lived solely on the money of foreigners. Their senators at this time were Richard Annabaldi of the Calassium, from which the Annabaldi had already expelled the Frangipani, and Gentile Orsini, whose name may still be read on an inscription in the Capitol. These gentlemen did not permit the pious enthusiasm of the pilgrimage to prevent them from making war in the neighborhood. They allowed the pilgrims to pray at the altars, but they themselves advanced with the Roman banners against Toscanella, which they subjugated to the capital. We may imagine on how vast a scale Rome sold relics, amulets, and images of saints, and at the same time how many remains of antiquity, coins, gems, rings, statues, marble remains, and also manuscripts were carried back by the pilgrims to their homes. When they had sufficiently satisfied their religious instincts, these pilgrims turned with astonished gaze to the monuments of the past. Ancient Rome, through which they wandered, the book of Mirabilia in their hand, exercised its profound spell upon them. Besides the recollections of antiquity, other memories of the deeds of popes and emperors, from the time of Charles the Great, animated this classic theatre of the world in the year 1300. Every mind alive to the language of history must have felt deeply the influence of the city at this time, when troops of pilgrims from every country, wandering in this world of majestic ruins, bore living testimony to the eternal ties which bound Rome to mankind. It can scarcely be doubted that Dante beheld the city in these days, and that a ray from them fell on his immortal poem, which begins with Easter week of the year 1300. The sight of the capital of the world inspired the soul of another Florentine. I also found myself, writes Giovanni Villani, in that blessed pilgrimage to the holy city of Rome, and as I beheld the great and ancient things within her, and read the histories and the great deeds of the Romans, which Virgil, Sallust, Lucan, Titus Livius, Valerius, Paul Orosius, and other great masters of history have described, I took style and form from them, although as a pupil I was not worthy to do so great a work. And thus in 1300, returned from Rome, I began to write this book to the honor of God and St. John, and to the commendation of our city of Florence. The fruit of Villani's creative enthusiasm was his History of Florence, the greatest and most naive chronicle that has been produced in the beautiful Italian tongue, and it is possible that many other talented men may have received fruitful impressions from Rome at this time. For Boniface, the Jubilee was a real victory. The crowds that streamed to Rome showed him that men still retained their belief in the city as the sacred temple of the united world. The monster festival of reconciliation seemed to flow like a river of grace over its own past, and to wipe away the hated recollection of Celestine V, of his war with the Colonnas, and all the accusations of his enemies. In these days he could revel in a feeling of almost divine power, as scarcely any pope had been able to do before him. He sat on the highest throne of the West, adorned by the spoils of empire, as the vicar of God on earth, as the dogmatic ruler of the world, the keys of blessing and destruction in his hand. He beheld thousands from distant lands come before his throne and cast themselves in the dust before him as before a higher being. Kings, however, he did not see. Beyond Charles Martel, no monarch came to Rome to receive, as a penitent, absolution for his sins. This shows that the faith which the battles of Alexander III and Innocent III had formerly won was extinguished at royal courts. Boniface VIII closed the memorable festival on Christmas Eve of the year 1300. It forms an epoch in the history of the papacy, as in that of Rome. The year of jubilee and enthusiasm was followed, in terrible contrast, by the tragic end of the Pope, the fall of the papacy from its height, and the decline of Rome to a condition of awful solitude. End of section 39. End of the Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 6, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd.